Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm very pleased to welcome YouTuber Rose of Dawn. Rose, how the hell are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yes, I'm excellent. Thanks very much. So a lot's changed since we've last talked to each other. JK Rowling's been massive news. You've been on the telly talking to Piers Morgan and various other individuals. Maybe before we get into all that, you could tell me a little bit about yourself for my viewers and listeners who are not aware or didn't listen to the last episode. How would you describe what you do?
Okay, so I would say that I run a YouTube channel that mostly discusses identity politics, specifically regarding trans issues. I'm a trans woman, and so I feel like that almost kind of gives me a bit of a license to be more critical of a lot of what the community does than your average cis het white male might. I am someone who politically leans to the right, which is something that actually seems to upset a lot of LGBT people, because they seem to have this assumption that if you are a minority group, you have to effectively have the same beliefs that they do, which is something which I find completely bigoted, but obviously they don't see it in that way. But I mostly have discussed trans issues that have been happening in the news, along with prominent names within the community, or just general ideas around identity politics and the subjects that it covers.
Okay, so with you saying you're politically right-leaning, would you classify right as synonymous with conservative at the same time? Would you describe yourself as a conservative? Because I mean,
not really.
No, I was going to say some might find that strange. So how would you define your right-leaning politics?
How would that be strange if I was conservative?
Because a lot of people would say that conservative ideologies are not necessarily accepting of the idea one can change their gender, or gender norms are so fluid to the point where people can live out a different identity to the one they were assigned at birth. So you don't necessarily find a lot of conservative speakers campaigning for trans rights, do you?
No. But at the same time, there are other issues and other beliefs from within conservatism that someone might agree with. They don't have to agree with every view that comes out of a particular ideology, out of a particular kind of church of thought, as it were. And I would find the same with conservatism. There are segments within the conservative movements which are anti-LGBT marriage, those kinds of issues, but you would still see quite a prominent kind of gay following within conservatism. For example, the Walk Away movement in America was founded by a guy named Brandon Straka, who is openly gay. A lot of their more prominent speakers, such as Mike Harlow or Blair White, are openly LGBT as well. Then you have people like Ariel Scarcella, who's getting more and more involved with the log cabin Republicans, and other people from within that movement going along with that as well. I would say that there is a lot within conservatism that could actually appeal to LGBT people. But just to be clear, I don't necessarily consider myself a conservative. My own views on politics are more, I would say, more lining up with libertarianism, more the idea of people ultimately in freedom of the individual. To me, is kind of like my most for me, that's the most important kind of belief that I hold. However, there are parts of conservatism that I do agree with, including kind of self-responsibility, self-sufficiency. Those are very conservative beliefs. But then I also have a lot of liberal beliefs as well. And again, a lot of my liberal beliefs are about kind of the freedom that I believe that everyone should have. I find that there is a lot within the political right that is there to really appeal to LGBT people, as I mentioned. And it's important not to just get hooked on the parties that are necessarily involved. Like, for example, the Conservatives over here or the Republicans in America. There might be elements of those that aren't necessarily pushing identity politics, or because I think for a lot of conservatives, they just don't care. They don't care about whether somebody is gay or trans or whatever. Whereas on the left, identity politics is very much more entrenched. And this is when you see a lot of kind of left-wing movements being the ones to spearhead it. Because a lot of the time they will try and kind of organize based on identities, based on different labels. I mean, things have kind of progressed a lot since, like, the kind of ideas of Marx and Engels about, like, you have like the workers and then you have the bourgeoisie, and it's now kind of moved more onto actual kind of identities that people don't really have a lot of control of, including their race, including their gender, including who they want to sleep with. Do you understand where I'm coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure, there are certain issues that are sort of kind of baked into conservatism. You can kind of pick and choose the fights that you want to get involved in. I mean, I don't see, yeah. I wouldn't say, for instance, that if you're trans, you can't be a conservative the same way, obviously, Kanye West can't be told he can't be a Republican because he's black. But I mean, I'm sure we'll get on to a lot of the ways in which identity politics ruins the discussion, especially leftist ownership of trans issues.
Yes.
But I mean, before we do that, I think it might be worth mentioning and talking about ways in which trans rights could need some attention in the UK especially, and I think you'd be in the perfect place to talk about the actual real issues that are being overlooked, because I do feel that sometimes getting so invested in identity politics, we might be in danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater in that sense. So I mean, what kind of real areas do you feel you could highlight in terms of disparity for trans people, inequality, things like that in the UK that really do need some attention?
The big thing that really jumps out, and I think a lot of trans people would agree with me when I say this, is basically trans healthcare in the UK, specifically through the NHS. So at the moment, if you need to be referred to a gender identity clinic, you could be waiting up to 36 months for your first appointment. So that's 3 years. And this is why I advocate for a lot of people who are new to the transitioning to go the private route, where there is still going to be a bit of a wait, because a lot of these clinics are quite popular, but it's going to be substantially shorter than effectively 3 years. And
it's going to be very expensive, though, isn't it? Private healthcare, gender treatment, things like that.
Not necessarily. I mean, if you're going to see a specialist and you're just getting referred, like some hormones, for example, that can set you back a couple of £100. If you were to go the full private route for surgery, which I know a lot of trans people in the UK actually do opt for because the results are generally better, that case you would probably be looking into the tens of thousands. And trans healthcare is very rarely covered in workplace health insurance, which is quite frustrating. And when it comes, I think that is something which a lot of trans people could advocate for in their workspaces for these procedures, which we do need. Like, we're not getting these surgeries just to, just kind of live out a fantasy or anything like that. It is stuff which we really kind of need in order to feel comfortable within ourselves. And I think that would be a good place for people to actually kind of campaign on and make it more kind of universally accepted that these things should be covered by health insurance. In fact, I find it kind of strange that a lot of these companies will act very woke, and they'll have, like, during Pride Month they'll have lots of rainbows and trans women are women, trans lives matter, all of this kind of stuff, but they won't actually take the action which is needed. And the action which is really needed is to make sure that there is accessible healthcare. Like, I shouldn't necessarily have to be telling people to go the private route, even if I generally do think the private route is better than the NHS. I can understand that it's not going to be hugely accessible for everyone. But what other choice really is there? Waiting 3 years is unreasonable. And so I feel like really that's the only option people have. There's no way I could tell people to just sit back and, they might be able to self-medicate with hormones, but will they even need hormones? Just because they're seeing a specialist doesn't mean they're going to get them hormones. They need to be examined before they do so. And so they shouldn't really be self-medicating. I think that medical care is the real important thing for trans people to focus on, because outside of that, legally, there isn't any kind of rights that I don't have that other people have. When we see people mentioning about the kind of rights that we are denied, these aren't even necessarily rights in themselves. Like, for example, I saw someone saying the one right that we don't have, it would be to get married in a religious ceremony. But that would really be up to the church first and foremost as to whether they wanted to do anything like that. I don't think the government should be legislating whether or not a religion has to marry a trans person or not. That should be up to the church itself. And so that's not really a place for us to campaign on unless we are members of the church. If we were members of the church, then that's something which we could push, but I'm not, and I don't want to tell a church how to run things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree in the sense that it's, the church, their house, their rules kind of thing. But I think it gets a little bit murky when you look at the sort of state subsidies and tax benefits they receive and things like that. So, I mean, you could make an argument that it is their duty in that sense, taking public money to serve the public in an equal and even-handed way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm against kind of state subsidies for religion anyway. I think that it kind of shows that the state would be favouring one faith over another. And that's something which, even if in recent months I have, because I consider myself an atheist, I have kind of been questioning that over the last couple of months, especially as I've been through quite a difficult period. But that kind of hasn't changed my idea that I don't want the state to basically be endorsing any religious belief. I think a religious belief is something which is personal to each person. And even if Christianity is something which has been a big part of British culture, I'm still not comfortable with it being effectively, kind of on the bankroll of the state.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. So you were talking there about, you more or less consider yourself somebody who has a full set of rights that any individual in the UK has access to. So I suppose it comes down to in a way to sort of reasonable expectations of the wider public. And you would have noticed there's a lot that there's been some concerted efforts to police language or ideas or thoughts. And I'm just wondering, these people who would consider it a hate crime, obviously, to misgender somebody, to use the wrong pronoun, there's a lot of campaigning behind that from some of the highest levels as well. And I'm just wondering, where do you think the line is in terms of your rights to live the life that comes most natural to you versus what other people may say and think about your life?
Well, really, a right is just something which doesn't require labour from anybody else to be able to do. And I think that it would be wrong to insist that someone be arrested or fired or anything like that simply for misgendering me, because I'd be making them refer to something if they don't want to. We'd effectively be making them speak a certain way. And I'm completely against that. I do think that misgendering is rude. I think that it can be considered offensive, but that's very different to it should be criminalised, that it should be punished. If someone were to repeatedly refer to me as a man, I could walk away from that. And I think that that's a perfectly fine way of dealing with it. It might upset some people. Particularly on the radfem side, they might think, well, they'll be using male pronouns, obviously, but they might think I would have to speak with them, but I don't have to. I can just take myself away from that situation. But what I don't want to see happen is instances where people, and this unfortunately has happened over the last number of years, where people have been reported to the police for misgendering. It sounds strange, but we're lucky that this hasn't actually ended with like a real conviction or sentencing, specifically about misgendering. But it feels like we're creeping up to that moment. And when we pass that line, we're going to be in a very scary world, because when we talk about misgendering, sometimes it might just be about, you'd see like a trans activist hold up a picture of someone like Paris Lees. If you don't know who she is, I think she's a journalist at The Guardian. She occasionally appears on television. She's very, very attractive. She looks very female. And so they would hold up a picture of Paris and would say like, well, this is what we mean when we're talking about gendering people correctly. But your average person would refer to Paris Lees as a woman because that's what they see. But really the problem with, you have to use these correct pronouns is when you get people who just don't put any effort into their transition. And there is a growing number of people who claim to be either trans women or non-binary, where they are basically just men. They dress like men. They look like men. They don't shave. They don't wear anything that's at all feminine. Sometimes they do, but they still give the overall impression that they are men. And so if you were to push for pronouns to be something that should be enforced, you would therefore have to refer to these people as women. And that requires a labor from people because you have to effectively deny what you're seeing with your eyes. Like, I have no problem using the correct pronouns for anyone who's put in some effort into it. I understand that it's very, very hard for people to pass entirely as a different gender. I get that. But there's a difference between that and just absolute no efforts, whether it's non-binary or people claiming to be trans women. These people do exist.
Okay, so what about, I think when we last spoke, we were both kind of on agreement that Jessica Yaniv, for instance, is fairly obviously a sexual predator with some sort of weird fetish. I mean, and that's just my gut instinct, of course, and that's what I see and think when I see them.
Yes.
But and you, I think at the time, said that you would not consider them authentically trans either. However, that is someone who does attempt to present female, whether or not it's convincing or not. They wear feminine clothes. They have the long hair. They are, they have a voice affectation. So that's somebody who is making an effort in that sense, but you'd still consider not authentically trans. Maybe you could just explain that a little bit.
Yeah. So Yaniv is a particularly special case because I did a lot of research into Jessica Yaniv last year. This was before the big ball waxing case really went viral when people like Blair White started making their videos. I'd covered Yaniv in a video previously, and so that involved really looking into their history. And I became very, very suspicious of their motives as to why they are going down this route. And Yaniv is someone who has a history of being incredibly sexual and dodgy with particularly young girls, with this obsessions of things like periods and also it gets very, very disgusting. But long story short, Yaniv genuinely does not come across to me as though they even have like gender dysphoria or they're genuinely trans. And I make that call because I'm not going to be put into a position where everyone who says they are trans, I have to automatically accept them as being trans. I'm happy to acknowledge a great many people as being trans, but Yaniv, it isn't so much just because I think they're a predator, but it's just their behavior and their actual, like, just the way in which they have been for so long. I only kind of come to that conclusion after doing my research. That's why I kind of say it. It's a similar situation with someone called Christian Weston Chandler, also known as Chris Chan. Chris Chan is a notorious victim of online trolling, who got like 4chan's attention back in 2007. And since then, he's been trolled like almost daily by all these people on the internet. Eventually, he came out as being trans. But I think I did research into Chris Chan and like his life, and I felt very confident that I could come out and say, actually, no, he isn't trans. Just because people say they are trans doesn't mean you have to respect it.
Yeah, so it's not just solely an aesthetic judgment. Then the behaviour's got to be taken into account as well, history, things like that.
Yeah, but like if you were to if I'm not to know someone's background, then I probably would just go based on aesthetic alone. But with the instances where if I don't use someone's pronouns or anything, there's normally a reason for it. I'm not being a bitch just because I think, screw them or anything. Like, I will have looked into them. I mean, that I think like that's just the fairest way of going about it, because I can't just say that every single person who says they are trans has to be respected, because there's a lot of people who just aren't. And they're able to take advantage of it, especially when it's becoming more and more kind of, you're getting more and more political credit for coming out as being trans, and you get more and more cover from the progressive stack because you can claim another level of oppression. And if all you need to obtain that is just to self-identify, and that's it, because if anyone who says they are trans is valid, they don't have to put in any work. That's the logic. So if they don't have to put in any work at all, then like, why should I kind of respect that? I think that it's ridiculous.
Well, maybe that'll bring us on to something that strangely has become a massively hot topic, especially in the corporate world, especially in the realm of advertising, and that's the concept of a woman, what it means to be a woman, what words we can use. You would have no doubt seen the endless chain of synonyms used for women, from menstruator to birther to, I think somebody used bleeders, which... I think
everyone bleeds.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think I saw a tweet from Andrew Doyle the other day, and he quite very cleverly pointed out that if he was to come up with some misogynistic terms for women, you wouldn't go far wrong to use terms such as bleeders and menstruators and things like that. So, I mean, I suppose the first question is, the big question is, how are we defining a woman? What is the criteria to be considered a woman in your view?
Well, I mean, the baseline really is a biological adult human female.
Yeah.
So, let me kind of explain on this and what my position is. It basically, as a trans woman, I know I'm not biologically female. I have to not be female, otherwise I wouldn't be a trans woman. We are not going to be exactly the same as your average woman. What we look at doing is, basically, if we want to, we see ourselves in that way, we want to be treated in that way. So we make the steps that we need so society can effectively treat us in that way. However, we are not the same as a biological woman. And I think that we're spending a lot of time on this definition of a woman and trying to redefine it. So it basically includes anyone who says that they are a woman. We don't need to redefine it. We all know what a woman is. There's no need to have a conversation about it. Obviously in shorthand, or to people who might not know my past, I've probably just referred to myself as a woman in kind of like an offhand kind of way. I'm unlike what some radfans might want, I'm not going to go around announcing I am a trans woman or that I'm a man or anything like that, or anything that would kind of give me dysphoria. But if we're talking in like a purely legal sense, then trans women aren't exactly the same as biological women. Like, it's fair to draw a distinction between the two groups.
I agree with you there, but there are a number of people, almost exclusively on the political left, who want us to accept that biology is more or less a social construct. And I mean, that I feel perfectly justified in saying that's insanity, given the growing. I mean, given the field of biology for a start. I think we've established there are gender differences, or differences in the sexes, however you want to turn it. So, what is the game that's being played here on the left, where they want us to accept that biology, or sex specifically, is a social construct, and they're going to great lengths to use terms to sort of be more inclusive instead of the word woman? What is their rationale here? Because we already know that trans people make up a very small percentage of the population in general, so it's not necessarily a market they can tap into for money. Because I tend to be very cynical with businesses when they're supporting certain causes. I don't necessarily think it comes from a place of wanting to do well. It's all about the dollar, the bottom line. So, but what is the game that's being played here?
I think like there is a lot of businesses wanting to make money and things. That's why, especially during Pride Month, a lot of them will go all out to with the rainbows and everything, and then as soon as Pride Month ends, it all disappears. Like, a lot of that is kind of cynical money grabbing. But I think at the same time, there are a lot of people who engage in entryism, which is kind of a Trotskyist practice of making sure that you get high positions, and then you can effectively load the bases with people who agree with you. And I think that a lot of this is happening within the corporate world, especially when you have companies that have, they'll have like diversity officers. They will have like their own kind of like employee networks and committees based on being LGBT, as an example. And with the kind of the cultural power which the left currently has, because whether they like to admit it or not, I mean, they probably don't like to admit it, but they have the cultural power right now, so they can get away with a lot of this. They are able to effectively set the agenda for a lot of these companies. I mean, when we have a look at video game companies, you will see that there are a lot of left-wing people, like proper leftists. I don't just mean someone who might just kind of, occasionally vote Democrat or anything like that. I'm talking kind of person who reads Marx.
Right.
And agrees with Marx. And these people actually do have positions where they're able to dictate what the companies do. That's only a small part of it. That's specifically addressing why are corporations stuff getting into it. And I think it's because there are a lot of people in positions of power who are able to push these various beliefs. I think that there is a bigger answer specifically around trans issues. So around 2015, before 2015 in the UK, same-sex marriage became law in America. Equal marriage became a reality across all the states. And so effectively, for a lot of people, the fight for gay rights is over. There's not really much more that they need to fight. It's more just, like combating generic homophobia. But as far as legality is concerned, there's not really much more that they can twist. But with trans stuff, you can. I mean, whilst I think that there is absolutely no other rights that we have, there are certainly a lot of avid activists who do believe in lots of things which actually aren't rights, but they like to perceive them as such. And so this is effectively the next frontier. Like, you always want to try and find within the left, it's a lot of currency to try and find the most oppressed, because a lot of what leftists believe is about effectively you have an oppressed group and then you have the oppressor. And for trans people, they're effectively the new it group. It's trendy. It's, these are people who are they're oppressed by all of these different kinds of, intersectional issues, and you can tie it in with other intersectional issues as well. And there is a lot of currency to this, not just trans stuff. You can tie it in a lot with Black Lives Matter. In New York, back in June, you had like a big Black Trans Lives Matter protest, which is fascinating, because BLM is supposed to be about police brutality, and Black Trans Lives Matter. Well, let's just say that whilst they'll bring up the figures of Black trans women who have been murdered in America, over the last year, none of the Black trans women, from what I've seen, were murdered by police officers. In fact, all of them were murdered by Black men.
That is a very uncomfortable statistic that I have noticed too, but that delving into the numbers and pointing out the hypocrisies that way can obviously bring certain labels your way. And I suppose that might bring us on to JK Rowling in a sense. Rowling, I get this wrong every time. Rowling.
Yeah, I mean, I said Rowling a lot when I did a video a few months ago, and I think that's probably wrong. I think it's Rowling.
See, I went with Rowling on a podcast the other week, and then I got corrected to Rowling. She should not be named. I think that's more fitting. But for instance, so when we talk about the average individual, the average Joe, like somebody like me, for instance, who might pontificate on trans issues and just get it wrong, either out of ignorance or just having the wrong opinions, I am liable for getting in a lot of trouble, and my employer might be notified. I could be hauled in front of HR. I could even get a knock on the door from the police, depending on what I say. And JK Rowling, for instance, is somebody who's got fuck you money. She's comfortable, she's safe, she probably doesn't have to sell another book a day in her life to be comfortable. So that gives her a certain level of immunity from all this that the average Joe doesn't have. And I'm not saying she's not been affected by the vitriol that she's had from her opinions. Obviously, it's very unpleasant. It's been very targeted and nasty. But she's somebody who can withstand it better than most people. And I just wanted to sort of get into a little bit about what it is she said specifically that's caused so much contention, because you'd think she called for the extermination of trans people, or she's come out against trans rights, or she's denied that trans is a thing. And everything I've read seems to suggest that she's pro-trans rights. She's coming from a place of compassion and concern for trans rights and the rights of women and the rights of everyone, including children. And she's made a few conclusions about pushing people down the path of transition too early and things like that. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what you think her viewpoint is on this, and maybe some areas you may have identified, I don't know, where maybe she's missed the mark perhaps, and that's what's led her into hot water.
So she's someone who has effectively been a target for a lot of radical activists for a number of years. She was seen liking gender critical tweets on Twitter, or like kind of following problematic accounts. But it was one specific tweet in May about kind of menstrual issues in Africa, where it just said people who menstruate, and it was kind of like a sarcastic comment of like, oh, isn't there a name for these people? Isn't it Wumbin or something like that? And that was what really opened the floodgates. And she ended up making a big blog post where she details a lot of what her thoughts are. And she discusses the case of Maya Forstater, who had her contracts, like she was a contractor, effectively had it not renewed because of her views on trans people. Like she mentioned about the way in which a lot of young people seem to be pushed into transitioning. There were a few things in the article that I did disagree with. One is a common belief from the gender critical side that like trans men are their sisters, and so that they include trans men in their groups because they're their sisters and stuff. And I think a trans man's not really going to want to be referred to in that way, so it's not really showing a lot of respect for them. But on the whole, she didn't say anything really outlandish. In fact, I don't think she really said anything that your average person on the street would disagree with. But one of the problems that this kind of caused is, for some activists, they considered it to be a dog whistle. And it's I find the thing that I find very fascinating about the term dog whistle is it seems to be exclusively heard by people who want to set the agenda as to what that dog whistle means. Like your average person on the right or the gender critical or anything like that, like they're not really going to hear this coded language. But it's always the activist who's trying to tell everyone, no, this is what it means, when it probably literally doesn't have any more meaning than what the sentence says. There's a lot of people trying to find some sort of hidden meaning within what she was saying and try and tie it in with other things. And ultimately,
not forgetting that only the dog's supposed to hear the whistle, and a lot of these pro-trans activists can hear transphobic dog whistles better than the average person, which is a separate issue, I suppose.
Yes, that's right. And so a lot of the time they were looking through JK Rowling's article, trying to point out various things to say like, oh, look, this is coded language for how much she hates trans people here or there. And it became incredibly nasty incredibly quickly. A lot of people felt very empowered to abuse her online. There were death threats sent her way, all sorts of really horrendous things being said. And very few of this was actually being called out by some of the more bigger name activists who were in positions where they could actually be like, hold on, guys, this is getting a bit ridiculous. But of course, like to them, this abuse is completely fine because it's against a target they agree with. I mean, to tie this into like another kind of modern day example, you had Dawn Butler a couple of years ago saying it's completely unacceptable to abuse MPs in any way, shape, or form. If you disagree with them, you shouldn't be calling them names or anything like that. But then after Angela Rayner called a Tory MP scum, Dawn Butler has actually just been inciting it more and more.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and that's because to not just to Dawn, but to your general leftist, they consider the right to be less than human. And so it's different. So if you attack them directly because they're people, they have feelings. But the right are subhuman vermin. I mean, like that's what Rufus Hounds called anyone who voted Tory, like vermin. And like that's fine for them to do because they genuinely see their opponents as filth. When they say these things, they're being very honest with you. They do not consider their opponents to be human. And it is the same thing with JK Rowling. They didn't consider her human. So it's fine to talk about her in such horrific ways. If that was aimed at someone who was on their side, they would be, shouting from the rooftops about the misogyny, which because a lot of it really was. I don't like jumping in with claims of misogyny because I do find that the radical feminists do that with literally everything that's ever said against a woman. But when Rowling was concerned, there was a lot being aimed at her based on her being a woman by supposed progressives.
Yeah,
of all people,
a lot of it was very sexually aggressive as well, which is quite scary.
Yeah, like these aren't people on the far right. These are our so-called moral superiors, and it was perfect. It was perfectly acceptable for them to speak about her in such a repugnant way, and nobody who was in a position where they could help calm this down, not a single one stepped in to call it out, because they never ever do. And this is why I wanted to defend Rowling. I don't think she said anything which was out of order, anything which, there are things in it that I disagreed with, but there's absolutely nothing that means that she should be kind of ostracized from modern society, or that she deserves any ounce of the abuse that she got.
I mean, even if she was entirely wrong, it still wouldn't justify her being treated that way because of an opinion as well.
No, you have places like Pink News trying to say, well, she's still able to make money with her the Comoran Strike novels. So this is proof that she hasn't been cancelled. But that she was able, as you said before, she was able to survive this because she is such a big name. I mean, Harry Potter is the biggest franchise made in the West since Star Wars. It's a huge cultural phenomenon. And that's not going to that's grown to be bigger than she is. Like in the same way Star Wars is bigger than George Lucas. It's the same level. So she was always going to, kind of have her. She was still always going to be someone who is in a fairly comfortable position. But if she was a smaller name, not a chance would she still be around. If Harry Potter was only a fraction of the size that it is, she'd probably be completely removed from public life, or at least not so much by the law, but they try and make it toxic to effectively talk about it. And in a way that has happened when people have tried to put up posters, whether it's in train stations in Scotland or on billboards in Canada, simply saying the words, "I love JK Rowling." There have been online stores where people have said, "I love JK Rowling," and sold it as merch. And all of this stuff is being removed. It's not making a statement on trans people. It's literally saying, "Hey, I really like this woman." And you're not allowed to say that anymore because these places will just remove it. And that is a form of cancelling. And this is the kind of thing that I was invited on to Good Morning Britain to discuss, when we had people like Benjamin Butterworth saying that cancel culture simply doesn't exist. When even if JK Rowling has been able to, kind of keep a living, so to speak, there's been enough that she has taken some damage. If it's not acceptable to say that you like a person, then you have effectively done something to try and remove them from the public space. And that is what has happened with JK Rowling.
Well, since you mentioned your interview on Good Morning Britain, that's a kind of flagship breakfast TV show in the UK, hosted by, is Piers Morgan, is it Susanna Reid?
Yes.
Usually?
Yes.
And you were invited on there to talk about the whole controversy surrounding not only JK Rowling's comments, but some, purposeful misinformation about her new fiction novel. And firstly, it was nice to see you on there because it seems to me that the media specifically, or mainstream media, has a set idea of what a trans voice is, the kind of opinions they expect a trans person to hold. And obviously you're, in that sense, an alternative voice. So do you think, first of all, do you think we are starting to see a shift in terms of diversity of thought on this issue, with them inviting you on to represent the trans voice?
Potentially. So one of the reasons why you will normally hear only one narrative of trans voice on mainstream media is because basically it comes down to connections. So there are various kind of trans media companies, like these are effectively pressure groups, which have been set up to kind of deal with media and broadcasting, and so you have people with all those connections, and they're then able to get their mates onto television. And again, when I was discussing entryism, you have their mates being the ones who are able to commission who gets to go on what show. And so that's why we're hearing a lot of the same voices on trans issues. And there are only a handful of us who are really invited onto mainstream media nowadays that will actually kind of give a alternative viewpoint. One of the only other people I can think of is India Willoughby. And there's still quite a lot of trans stuff that I disagree with her about, but she's still someone who is, but she's only really on there because of her past in the media anyway, before she transitioned. I do think that it's important to get more diverse voices from within the trans community on especially on television, because it's a small community, right? Despite how much focus there is in the media and how much activists might try and big themselves up and make the community look much larger than it actually is, we're fairly small. And so your average person might not even know a trans person. But when all they come across is angry activists who are basically going on television or writing articles telling people what is offensive and what isn't, what you are allowed to say, what you should do, how you should treat people. If you don't do what we say, you're a bigot. And I think it's important to actually see that, no, we aren't all like that. We don't have... The trans community is too small to have the luxury of it being common knowledge that we're not all going to be the same. Like we're a fairly small group. And so you need to kind of have these people out in the public sphere to be able to show that actually, no, we are individuals. And the only part where that really kind of falls apart for a lot of trans activists is when it comes to non-binary, because as far as I have like really kind of known when I've looked into it, non-binary is more of a cultural phenomenon, and it seems to come almost exclusively from very specific left-wing spaces.
Yeah. It feels ironically like a very privileged concept to me.
Oh, it is. Everyone who I've ever met who has been non-binary has come from a middle-class background. Even if they like to pretend that actually they are working class, they're only saying that because they've been a part of some sort of socialist organization or socialist work, like some sort of socialist thing in university. And so they try and say it just for street cred. But a lot of these people come from very well-off backgrounds. They don't like to admit it, but they do.
Well, I believe that JK Rowling saw your appearance as well, and she reached out. Did she send you flowers? What happened there?
She did. Yeah, like that was like weird. So I got an email from someone claiming to be a representative of JK Rowling, and at first I was a little bit kind of skeptical because they asked for my details so they could send.
Oh yeah, being catfished.
And so I did kind of think, like, I had to do a bit of research into who it was who sent this email, and I was able to find out that this actually was kind of like a publicist or like a kind of a publicist firm who do work for JK Rowling. So I was able to verify that. And so I then gave them my address, and then they sent over, JK Rowling specifically, sent me a bouquet of roses.
Wow.
They just had a little message just saying, like, roses for Rose, thank you. And I still got the little card that came with. I'm keeping that now, like, forever. I mean, it's actually like insane just to think that, I grew up reading Harry Potter and JK Rowling knows who I am. Like, I can't get over that.
That's massive.
Like, it's one of the coolest things to ever happen to me. And it was really good timing because it was just after I moved into my new flat. So it was like the best housewarming present that I could possibly have.
Yeah, and obviously it really demonstrates how much it must mean to her to have voices that are fighting her corner and standing up for the values she'd expect from other women. Yeah,
like it's it was just such a incredible gesture. Like, I very rarely even get flowers from my own boyfriend. It was pretty special. It was pretty special. Yeah, and I had a lot of respect for her anyway. But like now, it's hard to put into words.
Wonderful. What a lovely gesture. She obviously appreciated what you had to say, for sure. We touched a little bit on sort of Pink News and Stonewall and places like that have really taken on this trans right issue. Every other article from Pink News now seems to be a trans issue story. And I'm just wondering, do you think the sort of gay movement and trans movement are natural allies in that sense? Because I've heard varied views from various people on this. A lot of gay people kind of think it's a bit of a foreign thing to lump in with their history and their experiences, and other people will suggest obviously it's a natural thing, really. It's two groups of people very misunderstood having to fight for equal rights, and there's a certain level of crossover between the issues they face. I just wondered what your view was on lumping in gay rights with trans rights.
So there's a definite crossover in certain issues between effectively the LGB and the T, but I would say that there's far more differences than there are similarities. I mean, effectively, for a lesbian or a gay or a bisexual, for them, the main concern was just to have legislation in place where they could be treated fairly in the same way that a mixed sex couple would be treated. Whereas with trans people, there is a lot more kind of issues involved, including transition therapies. And then you also kind of have like things like the Gender Recognition Act, which allows a trans woman to be treated as a woman in the law. So there's a lot really that are kind of different. One thing that I don't like about the kind of modern LGBT movement is they really they're very full on with this kind of like intersectional viewpoint of gay history. And when they talk about Stonewall, I think it's Marsha Johnson. I'm not sure whether I got his name right. A drag queen who was involved in the Stonewall riots, who is now kind of classed as a trans woman for some reason, when he wasn't. He was a drag queen. Interesting enough, Stonewall isn't the beginning of the gay rights movements, which a lot of them seem to paint it as. Stonewall is more just the point in which it became radical,
right?
And that's a major difference compared to what it was like prior to Stonewall. I mean, Stonewall is a big event, just not really for the reason why it's painted. But for a lot of that time, particularly like in the 70s and the 80s, when the fights were more within the public eye, they were still mostly led by gay men and lesbian women. These were the two big groups. And it was only really in the 90s that effectively the T joined with the LGB. I think the first use of LGBT as a phrase was in the late 80s, around 1988, 89, at least from my research. That's about as far back as it goes. So for this huge bulk of gay history, there was certainly an allyship, but it wasn't this kind of conjoined movement that people try and paint it as. And it's only very recently where things have kind of moved from LGB to then LGBTQIA+++.
Right.
I mean, a lot of organizations which are now known as LGBT organizations only really changed their name around 2015. As I mentioned before, that was just after same-sex marriage was passed, and they wanted a new cause that they could get comradey about. And then they joined up with the trans. And there's a lot of organizations that changed their focus in 2015. And it's a coincidence that they all did it just after same-sex marriage was passed in the UK.
Yeah, it's that their raison d'etre has evaporated and they need to keep campaigning for something, I suppose. But yeah. I mean, you touched on something that has just come to mind now about a sort of historical figure reframed as trans when they weren't. Yeah. And I've noticed recently someone like Eddie Izzard, who's always described themselves as a transvestite, a crossdresser. That's how they've always been referred to in the media. And I'll be honest, I don't know a whole lot about this apart from the fact I saw him referred to as trans in the media the other day. And I wasn't sure whether that was just the reporting or whether he's now self-identifying as trans and what that means if he is.
He's self-identifying as trans.
Right.
He has done so for a number of years now. A lot of this is basically to do with the widening umbrella of what it is to be trans. I mean, whilst the LGBT kind of community is growing more and more as like different kinds of identities, like being asexual, are being forced in there. Within the trans umbrella itself, that's been growing a lot. Whereas it used to simply mean transsexual. You have gender dysphoria, you transition. That used to be all it meant. But now it just means people who, might want to cross-dress. I mean, Eddie Izzard is famous for being a transvestite. I mean, he referred to himself as a transvestite in a lot of his stand-up. Like in one of them, I remember like one particular skit when he's I think he's in Piccadilly Circus or around there, and someone just comes up to him and is like, "Oh, are you a man in a dress?" And he's just like, "Yes." and he does it in a really funny way. But the point of it is he's doing this because he's a man who likes to wear dresses, he likes to wear skirts. But now that in itself is its own gender, it's its own gender expression. And he is quite ingrained with a lot of these kind of queer activists nowadays when he wouldn't have been a few years ago. And so it's only natural that he kind of catches the transness from them. It's only from associating with these people. I mean, when you look at a lot of NBs, a lot of non-binary, that seems to kind of spread from person to person. They only seem to appear within kind of queer circles, within groups where there's all of this kind of almost kind of degenerate in a way. You just have one person coming in, it's like, oh, my pronouns are they and them, I'm non-binary, and then they don't do any kind of effort to change anything about them except for you now have to refer to them differently. So you have to do the work for them, which says a lot about their worldview. But pretty soon you will see more and more people within that community deciding, oh, actually, I quite like having some nail polish on. I'm now a they.
Yeah,
I'm now a they, and it spreads. It's insane. It's absolutely insane.
I think you've touched on something important there, because I share your view with this normalization, the ever expanding goalpost of what it means to be trans, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, and certainly progressive ideology that's being pushed into academia, our media, various institutions will have an effect in that sense. However, I do worry, and I try and check my biases where I can, because obviously we made the sort of comparison between being gay and trans earlier and how them two seem like allies now. And in living memory, obviously, being gay was pathologized. There was this sort of bigoted view as well that you could catch the gay in a sense. If we normalized homosexuality, you're your next, your son's going to be, pressured into being gay, or is going to grow up gay, etc. And to a lot of people, this kind of feeling that if you keep pushing the boundaries of what it means to be trans, that will invite more and more younger people to unnecessarily go down that route. That, to a lot of people, smacks of the same sort of bigotry. So, I mean, how do we explain to people that it's not the same thing here when we have genuine concerns about young people sort of maybe have, I mean, you talked about somebody putting nail polish on there. You might have a very feminine male, which is fine, or a very masculine female. So how do we draw a distinction there between what we saw with gay rights?
Well, a distinction is that the gay rights movement wasn't necessarily pushing for young people to become gay. Whereas when you talk with a lot of these gender radicals, they're trying to expand the definition of being trans to include all sorts of people within it. Like, the gays never wanted to expand the definition of being gay.
They've never knocked on my door, I'll be honest. Yeah,
they didn't want to expand on it. But when you're talking about gender and gender expression, the kind of activists who have spearheaded this are ones who are looking at, they have a very radical viewpoint of society. They want to tear down societal norms, society's expectations. And so to them, it's an advantage to tear down all of your conception of gender and replace it with their own. It's, in a way, they're quite similar to the radical feminists who say that they want an end to gender. A lot of trans activists would be very, very similar, except for instead of an end to two genders, they want an end to, they want to replace that with thousands of genders, each one more special than the next. So that is a big kind of difference where we're kind of starting from. Like they're trying to expand it to include a lot of people, and that's something which I've been very much against. In fact, a lot of trans people are against it, but we are effectively sidelined. We're called things like true scum, bootlickers, for speaking out against it. And again, a lot of this came from very, very radical people. And they have effectively co-opted what was just an identity and turned it almost into its own political platform. And it didn't take them too long to do that, which is kind of worrying.
Yeah, the progression has been very pointed, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So we're just coming up to near the hour mark now, and I thought we best off end by the most important topic imaginable in this arena, and that's where one gets to pee. And the bathroom debate has just raged for years, and I think I was very blasé about it at the beginning. I just thought, whatever you decide's fine, just tell me where I can go when you come to a decision. But obviously there's these more serious ways in which this ties into women's spaces and their safety concerns and things like that. And it doesn't seem to me like there's a very eloquent solution to it, unfortunately. I mean, what are your thoughts on the whole bathroom debate?
So a lot of the kind of position that I've seen radical feminists propose as a counterpoint to it would be like third spaces. And there's certainly people who campaign on that, but I don't think third spaces are particularly realistic. I think it's almost like a utopian viewpoint, because where are they going to fit them in? And especially with a lot of kind of buildings that are currently do it, like that, would need to be converted to have them. Would the state be telling people that they have to do it? Would they then be giving people bursaries to be able to go out and, not bursaries, would they be giving grants so you can fit in a third gender space that would be always used by like one or two people? Mm-hmm. Probably not. Like it's highly impractical. So when it comes to the bathroom, it's something which I don't think there's a really kind of winning answer on. I think that for a trans woman who has transitioned, it would be very awkward to ask for her to use the men's bathroom. Like I've been using women's bathrooms for years now. Not once have I encountered any trouble or even felt like I've been causing any trouble just by being in there. I think that there's more of a conversation to have about changing rooms, where if you have a trans woman who hasn't had the surgery, that is much more of a risk. And so I think that the bathroom discussion in itself it's a bit of a red herring. I think that it would never be policed. We saw in states in America where they tried to pass bathroom laws that biological cis women were actually being stopped from using female bathrooms. As a result, it happened on a number of occasions. So there's, you in order to kind of enforce it, you would need almost like a bouncer to make a judgment call at every single person who goes into that room.
Yeah.
Like whereas a changing room, again, to have somebody as a bouncer on there would be a bit much, but there is at least more of a discussion that you can have if somebody, say, hasn't had gender reassignment surgery and is using a female changing room. That's something which I disagree with. I don't think that they should be doing it. If they have had surgery, then fine. I mean, I use female changing rooms, but I don't change in front of other people. I make sure, because I would feel very uncomfortable doing that. Like, who really wants to change in front of other people? Really? Like, if I could be given my own changing room that only I use, that would be brilliant, because I want that privacy anyway. Like, who the hell wants to see other people, unless they're a pervert? Like, who wants to see other people getting changed?
Yeah,
like, just check it changed. Like, that would be fine. But again, that's not really an option. But there are cubicles in changing rooms, and that's what I use because I'm a normal person. What normal people do, they don't want to get changed in front of other people. But that's more of a conversation to have than bathrooms, where the solutions are like implausible. And so really the only thing that I could say is more of a societal level. if you want to use a men's bathroom or a women's bathroom, as long as you're kind of trying to make an effort, then that's fine. But when you have people who say like they're a guy who is just an NB, but otherwise just looks completely like a guy and decides that they feel more comfortable in a women's bathroom, which is something that does happen, I think that that's taking the piss.
I do think there's something to be said for the advantages where cues are related for a woman to spontaneously identify as a male. Given my experience of the cues for women's loos, depending on the venue, there could be something there.
Oh God, yeah.
All right, Rose. Well, this has been great catching up. I'm glad you've come back on to speak to me, and I'm glad to see you out there talking more sense on this issue, and especially giving an alternative voice and showing people that there is a different perspective from trans people that they're not hearing. Because I think I mentioned on a podcast not so long ago that paradoxically we want to hear from trans people who aren't part of this loony fringe of the activists, but obviously they're just getting on with their life, living their life how they want, and they don't want anything to do with the public arena or identity politics, things like that. So paradoxically we need to hear from them people, but they don't want to be heard from, whereas you're making content and you're getting yourself out there and putting that viewpoint forward. So I think that's really helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.